Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something, well, deeply complex, and for many, intensely personal. The core motivations behind Joseph Smith's life. He founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and feelings run deep.
Absolutely. And this isn't about taking sides emotionally. We're aiming for a direct, evidence-based look, a debate you asked for, brutal, logical, passionate, using his own words, his actions as our sources.
Exactly. So the central statement we're debating is this. Joseph Smith's life was primarily motivated by worldly desires, rather than a true prophetic calling from God. Simple statement, very complex reality.
And we've got a lot to draw on: historical accounts, church documents, scholarly work. We're going to really test that statement rigorously.
Right, and we'll do it with a formal debate structure. Opening statements first, laying out the core arguments.
Then rounds of arguments, counter-arguments, digging into specific areas like finances, polygamy.
Followed by rebuttals, direct challenges.
Yeah.
And then cross-examination to really probe those points.
And finally, closing statements. We'll each summarize our case.
And then, importantly, we will declare a winner for this debate based purely on the evidence presented here today. I'll be arguing the case that worldly desires were, in fact, his primary motivation.
And I'll be arguing the opposite, that his life was fundamentally driven by a genuine prophetic calling from God.
Okay. Focus is laser sharp.
Yeah.
Historical record, his own words, his actions, what people around him did and said.
The goal: rigorous analysis, reasoned discussion, and a justified conclusion. We will name a winner based on this debate.
All right, let's dive in. Round one, opening statements. So, arguing for worldly desires. You have to start with the environment. The Second Great Awakening, yes, fertile ground for religion, but also folk magic, treasure digging. It was rife.
A very specific time, absolutely.
And Joseph Smith wasn't just aware of this, he was right in the thick of it. His early career, a money digger. We have sources, court records, 1826 trials specifically about treasure seeking. Eyewitness accounts, Willard Chase, Sally Chase, they worked with him. They described his methods, putting shiny dirt down to make it look like something was found, salting dig sites, deception. It wasn't just him. The whole Smith family was involved in folk magic. Joseph Smith Sr., a rodsman using divining rods. Lucy Mack Smith, his mother, wrote about drawing magic circles.
He was part of the culture then, wasn't it, to some degree?
Part of the culture, maybe, but their involvement was deep. Hiram's family had magic talismans, and crucially, found among Joseph Smith's own possessions after his death, the Jupiter talisman, an object specifically linked to gaining wealth and power.
Interesting detail.
This early stuff, the treasure digging, it casts a huge shadow. Even in his own history, recounting getting the gold plates, he admitted being tempted initially to seek riches. Said he was chastened for it.
He acknowledged the temptation, yes.
And what about trying to sell the Book of Mormon manuscript in Canada before it was even published? What does that scream, if not a desire for financial gain right out of the gate? You have to consider pious fraud, using deception for what you believe is a higher purpose. His early actions fit that mold pretty comfortably, I'd argue.
Okay, my turn. Arguing for a prophetic calling. Yes, the Second Great Awakening was intense, a huge search for spiritual meaning. Joseph Smith emerges as a seer in that context. That was a recognized role then.
A role often linked to finding treasure, though.
It was linked to folk practices, true, but we shouldn't just see it as folk magic. It could be seen as, perhaps, a precursor, a developmental stage towards a more profound prophetic vision. And look at the family's background.
Okay.
Lucy Mack Smith wrote about Joseph Sr.'s dream, the Tree of Life dream. That suggests a deep spiritual seeking within the family before Joseph Jr.'s main claims.
The spiritual inclination, yes.
And Joseph Jr. himself is a Methodist exhorter early on. That shows an interest, a commitment even, to religious leadership and communication. It wasn't just about digging.
But the digging was prominent.
It was part of his youth, yes. But the central claim, the audacious claim of the Book of Mormon, it wasn't just authorship, he claimed. It was divine translation from ancient records, reformed Egyptian. That claim itself points away from simple invention for gain. It points towards a divine source.
A claim easily made, harder to substantiate.
And finally, his own accounts. Angelic visits, warnings about establishing God's work. These narratives emphasize a divine mandate, a mission bigger than personal wealth. So my opening frame is, understand the context, yes, but see the potential for an evolving, genuine, prophetic calling driving these events.
All right, round two. Let's dig into that translation process in the early revelations.
Right.
Because the credibility of his translations, well, that's absolutely fundamental here. And the sources, they show some deeply problematic patterns.
Let's hear them.
Take the characters document. The symbols Joseph Smith claimed were from the gold plates. Independent analysis shows they match up almost perfectly with common English letters, numbers, and symbols available at the time. It's not just similar, it's a direct correlation. Every single character has an English source.
That's a strong claim.
And it's telling that the church itself has kind of shifted away from using those original characters in its publications now. They use more generic sort of pseudo-Egyptian symbols for Reformed Egyptian. Why change if the originals were legit?
Well, representations can evolve.
Then there's the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, the JST, pitched as restoring lost truths. But textual analysis, even from places like BYU, shows hundreds of direct ellipses, whole phrases, ideas from Adam Clarke's Bible commentary, a hugely popular commentary back then.
Influence versus direct copying. That's a fine line sometimes.
Is it revelation, or is it basically plagiarism repackaged as divine insight? And the Book of Abraham, this one is, frankly, damning. He claimed to translate it from Egyptian papyri. Leading Egyptologists, people who actually read Egyptian, are unanimous. Those papyri are common funerary texts. They date centuries after Abraham. They don't mention him at all.
The connection is debated, certainly.
Debated. The church's own gospel topics essays now admit the papyri don't match the Book of Abraham text. They concede the point. So you see this pattern. Characters matching English, JST borrowing heavily, Book of Abraham papyri completely misidentified. It strongly suggests a worldly origin, fabrication, not divine translation.
Okay.
And add to that, the role of the Book of Mormon itself changed. First, it supposedly contained all things needed. Later, it was just the foundation. That shift gave him flexibility, right, to introduce new doctrines, new financial rules, new power structures later on. The core claim of translation seems demonstrably false in multiple cases. That severely undermines the prophetic calling argument.
Okay, responding to those translation challenges, it's vital, I think, to approach this with some nuance, consider the context and how Revelation was actually understood by those involved.
Nuance is fine, but facts are facts.
The process, as witnesses described it, wasn't simple translation like we think of it today. It was unique, spiritually mediated. So trying to map characters one-to-one onto English might be, well, oversimplifying something they saw as divine interaction. As for the JST and Adam Clarke, look, couldn't divine revelation work through existing knowledge? Maybe the plain and precious truths were insights sparked or clarified by the resources available to him? God using the tools at hand, perhaps?
Perhaps, or perhaps just copying.
And the Book of Abraham,
Yeah.
yes, the link to the physical papyri is acknowledged as unclear now, even by the church. But for believers, the text itself is often seen as the inspired revelation, a catalyst for profound spiritual truths, regardless of the exact historical origin of the scrolls themselves.
That sounds like moving the goalpost after the fact.
Or maybe it's understanding Revelation in a different way. And the evolving role of the Book of Mormon, that could be seen as a natural unfolding. As the church grew, understanding deepened, challenges changed, revelation might adapt. These complexities don't automatically cancel out a prophetic calling. They show how divine communication might happen through, well, imperfect human channels in a specific time and place.
Let's move to round three then. Finances. Power. Because the structures Joseph Smith set up early on, they tell a very compelling story about worldly motivations. Take the law of consecration, introduced soon after Sidney Rigdon arrived.
Rigdon, yes, a key figure.
The language was mandatory. Thou shalt consecrate all thy properties unto the church. That's not optional. Then there's the free offer of surplus property, which sounds voluntary, but in practice, there was pressure. It was expected.
Aiming for a communal society, perhaps?
Perhaps. But consider this. Right around the same time, a commandment against going into debt, conveniently removed from their scriptures, just when Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon themselves had significant personal debts.
The timing.
And the United Firm. Supposedly for church welfare, funding projects. Yet Joseph Smith demonstrably used funds raised specifically for Zion's camp, a major expedition, to pay off his own personal debts.
There are different accounts of how those funds were managed.
He also pressured members back in New York for donations, implying they'd lose blessings if they didn't cough up. Then the Salem Treasure Mission, D&C 111, an explicit prophecy of finding treasure, gold, and silver. It failed. Completely. Only later did they reinterpret it as spiritual treasure.
Missions can have multiple purposes, or test faith.
Or just fail. Look at the Kirtland Safety Society, basically an uncharted bank. Joseph Smith was the biggest investor. It collapsed spectacularly, leaving huge personal and church debts. This failure directly fueled the massive apostasy, the dissent in Kirtland.
The Panic of 1837 was a major factor there, nationwide.
A factor, yes, but the bank was fundamentally unsound from the start, and Oliver Cowdery, one of the founding members, excommunicated partly for wanting control over his own property. That speaks volumes.
Property disputes were complex back then.
Tithing changed too. Went from 2% of net worth, pretty modest, to consecrating surplus property and explicitly including funds to pay the debts of the presidency. A direct financial benefit to Joseph and his inner circle.
The needs of the leadership had to be met somehow if they were working full-time for the church.
And Nauvoo. His land dealings as trustee and trust blurred all lines between church and personal wealth. He sold lots, potentially for more than suggested prices, urging members to buy from him. Church resolutions even gave him and his family church property and ongoing support. Plus, he took paid civic jobs, mayor, justice of the peace, while still calling on members for free labor. This isn't just one or two things, it's a consistent pattern. Financial gain, control over resources. It points squarely at worldly motivations being primary.
Okay, analyzing those financial activities, you really have to consider the immense practical hurdles. Starting a new religion, moving people, building communities, all in a hostile economic climate. It's incredibly difficult.
Difficult, yes, but does difficulty justify personal enrichment?
The law of consecration, strong language, yes, but the idea was rooted in a theological vision. Unity, community, caring for the poor, inspired by the Book of Acts. That the implementation had problems, faced external pressures, human failings. That doesn't necessarily kill the initial spiritual goal.
The implementation benefited him directly, though.
Removing the debt commandment? Maybe it was pragmatic. The economic realities were brutal, unpredictable. Maybe it was a necessary adaptation.
Convenient adaptation.
The united firm. It was arguably a necessary structure to manage what little resources they had, to support growth, build temples, the Salem mission. Maybe it did have a dual purpose, spiritual and temporal. Or maybe it was a test of faith, even if the gold didn't appear.
A test that failed financially.
The Kirtland Safety Society. Look, it was an attempt, maybe naive, maybe flawed, to create stability in a volatile economy. Its failure was massively impacted by the 1837 panic, something totally outside their control.
But initiated with questionable practices.
Tithing changes, maybe they were divinely guided adjustments. The church's needs were growing exponentially. How else do you fund it? And his land dealings, the compensation in Nauvoo, given the immense sacrifices he made, dedicating his entire life, maybe it was necessary support for his family and his role. These things look complex, sometimes messy, yes, but you can interpret them within the framework of building a self-sufficient religious movement under extreme duress, driven by a belief in a divine mandate, not just personal greed.
Round 4. Polygamy. The Council of 50. Here, the evidence for worldly desires, specifically power and control, becomes, I think, even stronger. His initial reluctance, the denials about polygamy, it suggests the problem wasn't just spiritual struggle, but the fact that it was socially toxic and, frankly, illegal.
It was incredibly controversial, a huge thing to ask of people.
The stories justifying it, the angel with the drawn sword demanding he practice it well, those accounts were written down years later. How reliable are they as a record of his initial motivations? There's also a noticeable lack of contemporary records for some supposed early plural marriages, like Fanny Elger.
Record-keeping wasn't always perfect, especially for sensitive practices.
And Emma Smith, his first wife. Her opposition was fierce, consistent. She even burned the manuscript revelation on plural marriage. That's a powerful statement from inside his own household.
Emma's perspective is complex, absolutely, a very difficult position.
Then there's polyandry being sealed to women already married to other living men. Where's the scriptural basis for that in any standard Christian view? It raises huge ethical questions about consent, power dynamics, potential coercion.
The theology of sealing was unique and evolving.
And the case of Helen Mar Kimball, sealed to Joseph Smith when she was just 14. 14.
Right.
You have to seriously question consent and the power imbalance there.
Age of consent was different then, but yes, it's a deeply uncomfortable aspect for modern readers.
Now the Council of 50. Presented as a political body, its goal, establish the kingdom of God on earth, a literal, temporal kingdom. They were focused on land, finding a safe haven from persecution in Illinois, yes, but operating with this belief in imminent end times. It sounds very much like worldly political ambition.
Seeking refuge in self-governance wasn't unreasonable given the persecution.
Initially, it included non-Mormons, but under Brigham Young, they were kicked out. Suggests a shift towards tighter internal control. The council planned the westward trek, establishing Deseret of physical territory. This was about temporal power.
Establishing a place where they could live their religion freely.
Joseph Smith's idea of theocracy, his run for president of the United States, that's clear political ambition. Control, influence, and the secrecy around the council, it created massive fear and suspicion from outsiders. Taken together, the way polygamy was implemented, the goals of the Council of 50, it paints a picture of a leader driven by far more than just spiritual concerns. Earthly power, control, establishing a literal kingdom that looks very worldly.
Okay, looking at polygamy and the Council of 50, again, context is crucial, as understood by the believers themselves. Joseph's hesitation on polygamy. It could absolutely be a natural human reaction to a shocking, difficult commandment that flew in the face of culture and law.
Or just fear of getting caught.
The later accounts of angels, yes, written later, but they reflect the deeply held experiences and convictions of those early members. They believed it was divine, the secrecy, probably necessary for survival given the intense opposition and illegality.
Secrecy also allows for abuse of power.
Emma's struggles are undeniable, but some accounts also show her participating, sometimes, in plural marriage ceremonies. It suggests a very complex, perhaps evolving situation for her, not just flat rejection always.
Participating under duress, perhaps. The power dynamic was immense.
Polyandry. Yes, it's theologically complex, poorly understood perhaps even then. But within their framework of eternal sealings, maybe it serves specific spiritual purposes related to linking families, even if we don't fully grasp it now. Power dynamics existed, absolutely, but within their context, faith and obedience to what they saw as God's will were powerful factors. We need sensitivity to the women's experiences, definitely.
Sensitivity, yes, but also a critical eye on the power Joseph held.
And the Council of 50. Members saw it as divinely inspired, governing the temporal kingdom alongside the church's spiritual leadership. Seeking freedom, a safe place that was a direct response to violent persecution.
But its structure was political, aiming for earthly rule.
Including non-Mormons initially. That could show Joseph's broad vision of a kingdom protecting religious liberty for all, not just Mormons. The westward trek, Deseret, seen as divinely guided steps for survival and growth. His presidential run, an effort to advocate for religious freedom and justice nationally, consistent perhaps with a prophetic role to protect his people and establish God's kingdom.
Round 5. The Danites. This is, well, deeply troubling, and offers, I believe, stark evidence of worldly motivations, specifically using force and earthly power. They formed in 1838 Missouri during intense violence against Mormons.
A very violent time, agrees. The Missouri context is critical.
Their structure. It mimicked Old Testament military groups, state militias, but the ultimate authority. Joseph Smith and the First Presidency. He attended their meetings, gave initial approval.
Approval for defense, possibly. Order.
Their formation followed Sidney Rigdon's Salt Sermon, a fiery speech targeting dissenters. And according to Samson Avard, a key Danite leader who later testified against Smith, their initial goal was to drive dissenters out of Caldwell County, forcibly.
Avard's testimony is controversial, given his later falling out.
But there's corroboration. A threatening letter to Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, other high-profile dissenters, signed by Hiram Smith and John Smith, First Presidency members, implicating leadership in silencing opposition through threats.
Strong warnings in a time of perceived betrayal.
Joseph Smith's own journal mentions the Danites were meant to put to right physically that which is not right and to cleanse the church of very great evils. That's chillingly vague, easily justifying violence.
Strong language reflecting a desperate time.
Avard testified about secret oaths, plunder, lie, even kill if necessary for the church. They engaged in political intimidation, trying to swing elections. They enforced consecration through coercion.
These are serious accusations, relying heavily on contested testimony.
But their actions went beyond internal matters. Violence against non-Mormon neighbors, the Gallatin Election Day riot, pillaging Millport in Gallatin, burning the post office, the county treasurer's office. These are documented events.
Actions by some individuals in a chaotic situation.
Luminous Shirtlift saw Joseph use Danite countersigns. Justice Morse testified Smith authorized a meeting to suck the milk of the Gentiles, basically, take resources from outsiders. Benjamin F. Johnson, a loyal Mormon, later admitted Mormon depredations against non-Mormon settlements happened.
Acknowledging conflict doesn't mean Smith directed every action.
At the Battle of Crooked River, Danite leaders Lyman White, David W. Patton, urged deadly force. Now, Joseph Smith did publicly denounce the Danites later, but only after he was facing serious legal charges.
Which could show him reasserting control, condemning excesses.
Or trying to save his own skin. Because afterwards, in Nauvoo, former Danites became his personal bodyguards, the Night Watch.
Yeah.
They were prominent in the Nauvoo police. One policeman even said in Smith's presence that Danitism was not down, it was a good system. No recorded reprimand from Joseph.
Loyalty and protection might explain keeping former associates close.
Former Danites were also key members of the Secret Council of 50, where there were allegations of secret oaths with death penalties. And Sidney Rigdon gave incredibly violent speeches as late as 1844, again, with no public censure from Joseph Smith. This pattern of organized intimidation, violence, extra-legal actions, seemingly endorsed or at least tolerated by leadership, points strongly to worldly power, control through force, not just spiritual guidance.
The Danites, it's undoubtedly a dark and highly contested chapter. Absolutely. And it happened during extreme persecution, escalating violence in Missouri. You cannot ignore that context.
Context doesn't excuse everything.
Some historians suggest they formed initially as a desperate self-defense measure, in a lawless environment where Mormons felt completely unprotected. The Old Testament parallels, maybe reflecting a desire for divine strength in terrible times.
Or a justification for their own aggression.
Joseph Smith's initial awareness, maybe tacit approval, perhaps motivated by a need for order, protection from internal threats dissent, was seen as dangerous to unity in external mobs.
But driving people out, threatening them.
The letter to dissenters, undeniably harsh. But maybe view it in context. Leadership perceiving betrayal, undermining the church in a crisis. Joseph's journal entry. Strong language, yes, but maybe reflecting a desire for justice, order, as he saw it, amidst brutality.
Putting right physically sounds like more than just order.
And we have to question the reliability, the potential exaggeration in later testimonies like Avard's, people with agendas. Historical accounts need critical reading.
But the actions against non-Mormons are corroborated by multiple sources, including Mormon ones later.
Regrettable instances of violence happened, yes, retribution, but it needs to be seen in the broader conflict. Both sides engaged in violence in Missouri. It was practically a border war.
So that makes Mormon violence okay.
Not okay, but understandable within that specific violent context. Joseph's later denunciation. Maybe it was an attempt to distance the church from unauthorized excesses, to restore order under legal and public pressure.
Convenient timing, though.
Continuing association with former Danites in Nauvoo could be pragmatic. Loyalty, needing protection given the constant threats against his life. Rigdon's violent talk, reflecting the immense pressure, fear, anxiety of the time, not necessarily a divine thumbs up for violence. Understanding the Danites means grappling with extreme persecution, tough decisions under duress, and the blurry lines between self-preservation and retribution in that conflict. It doesn't automatically negate a prophetic core.
Okay, round 6. Rebuttals and cross-examination.
You've built a strong case for worldly motives, focusing heavily on finances, the Danites. Actions that look bad, but I have to push back. Do these actions definitively prove worldly desire was the primary motive? Couldn't a prophet, even an inspired one, still be human, fallible, make judgment errors, face complex temporal problems requiring tough, maybe ethically murky decisions while still fundamentally believing in a divine mission?
It's the pattern, though, not isolated mistakes.
The financial needs were real, immense, a growing church, hostility everywhere. Attempts to meet those needs, even if flawed, could stem from wanting to build God's kingdom, not just line pockets. The Danites traveling, yes, but born of extreme persecution, survival at stake. Couldn't that be desperation, however misguided, rather than raw ambition?
Human fallibility allows for mistakes, yes. But treasure digging mirroring the Book of Mormon discovery narrative. Financial systems consistently enriching the leadership. Systematically silencing dissent with threats, a political kingdom alongside the spiritual one. Danite violence with apparent leadership approval. This looks like a consistent strategy for earthly power, wealth, control. It goes beyond simple errors. And while persecution was real, does it excuse threatening core members with fatal calamity for disagreeing? Does it justify documented pillaging and violence against neighbors? How do you square a divine movement with actions that look so, well, worldly and harmful, and that primarily benefited Smith and his circle.
But given that extreme persecution, denial of legal rights, mob violence, isn't it understandable, even if not justifiable now, that they'd resort to strong, even extra legal measures for survival? When you feel your community faces extinction, leaders make choices under duress. The Danite methods are highly criticizable, yes, but could they reflect desperation more than Joseph's core ambition? And finances, maybe not self-serving in isolation, could they fit a framework where he genuinely believed he was building a literal kingdom of God, needing temporal resources, infrastructure, loyalty?
But the direction of the money flow,
Yeah.
it overwhelmingly benefited him and his associates, tithing explicitly structured to pay their debts. Nauvoo land deals enriching them. It wasn't just funding the church, it was personal gain and consolidating economic power and suppressing dissent. Classic tactic of autocratic control, not usually a sign of someone secure in divine truth. If the revelations were truly from God, why the need to aggressively crush questions?
But isn't it also possible that many negative accounts are biased, exaggerated by disillusioned opponents? Historical narratives aren't neutral. How do we weigh accounts from enemies against those from believers who saw things through faith? How do we definitively know the true motive behind actions filtered through potentially biased records?
Which is exactly why we focus on his own words, his own journal, documented actions, revelations with specific financial clauses benefiting leadership, letters signed by the First Presidency making threats. These aren't just external attacks. This is evidence from within the movement that strongly suggests worldly ambition was deeply, undeniably intertwined with the religious claims.
Intertwined, perhaps, but can we definitively say worldly ambition was the primary driver? Is it impossible that a sincere belief in a divine call, however imperfectly executed, still underpinned everything, despite the controversies, the human failings, especially under such intense opposition?
Let's move to our final round then, round 7. Closing statements. In closing, the evidence reviewed today paints, I believe, a consistent picture. From the very beginning, the pattern is there. Treasure-seeking closely echoing the story of the plates themselves. Then, translations that demonstrably fail basic scrutiny. Financial structures consecration, the united firm, revised tithing that steadily concentrated wealth and benefited Joseph Smith and his inner circle personally. Add to that the creation of a parallel political kingdom, the Council of 50, his run for president, seeking earthly power. And finally, the documented use of force and intimidation through the Danites, silencing dissent, attacking outsiders, all seemingly with leadership approval. This isn't just coincidence or necessity, it's a pervasive pattern. While acknowledging the religious context and persecution, the sheer weight of evidence points to worldly desires, power, wealth, influence, control, as the primary engine driving Joseph Smith's actions, far outweighing any claim to a purely divine prophetic calling.
In my conclusion, while I fully acknowledge the complexities, the controversies surrounding Joseph Smith, finance, polygamy, the Danites are all difficult areas, the argument for a primary motivation rooted in a genuine prophetic calling remains compelling when you look at the whole picture and the enduring impact. Starting a global religion from nothing, millions of followers today, translating huge volumes of text claimed as scripture, inspiring intense loyalty and unity despite brutal, relentless persecution, the lasting power of his theological ideas. Does this all stem just from worldly ambition, the documented imperfections, the questionable decisions made in a chaotic, hostile environment? These need to be seen in that context. Temporal needs were real for building a literal kingdom of God as they saw it, but the overall arc of his life, I argue, points to a sincere, driving commitment, perhaps imperfectly realized at times, to what he profoundly believed was a divine mission, restoring God's true church on earth.
After carefully weighing all the arguments, the evidence presented, the rebuttals and cross-examinations in this deep dive, I have to declare a winner for this debate. Based solely on the evidence and arguments presented here, the winner is the position that Joseph Smith's life was primarily motivated by worldly desires.
Okay.
The consistent, documented pattern of financial self-interest, the clear pursuit and consolidation of political and temporal power, the serious unresolved issues with the foundational translation claims, and the documented use of coercive and violent means to maintain control. This body of evidence, taken together as presented in this debate, points more strongly towards worldly motivations being the primary driver than towards a purely prophetic calling being able to adequately explain the full range of actions. The context of persecution explains some things, certainly, but it doesn't, in my judgment based on this debate, sufficiently counter the weight of evidence pointing towards earthly ambitions.
While I respect your conclusion based on the arguments laid out here, I still believe a more nuanced view is possible, one that sees a complex interplay of spiritual goals and temporal actions within that incredibly challenging context. The debate over his ultimate motivations will surely continue.
It undoubtedly will, and this is, as we said at the start, incredibly complex and deeply felt. We know many of you listening have strong beliefs and different perspectives. We absolutely encourage you to continue your own research, dig into the sources yourselves, evaluate the evidence critically.
And maybe reflect on this. Considering everything we've debated today, what does it really mean to be a prophet? How should we evaluate the motivations of religious leaders, especially looking back through history, trying to balance their actions with their context? It's a crucial question.
A very provocative thought to leave you with. Thank you for joining us for this intense, deep dive. We appreciate you sticking with us through this difficult topic.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.